Through the hum of the engines and the muffled conversations of the passengers on board, there was suddenly an alarm cry. A hot stream of coffee burned the face of a man sitting in first class. The stewardess, with undisguised coldness in her gaze, merely adjusted her uniform and retreated a step away, without even attempting to apologize. A tension hung in the air, churning through the bones. No one knew that the man who had been humiliated was the owner of the entire airliner. What would you do if you were him? How would you react to such an injustice? Tell us in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. We always welcome your feedback. Our viewers, are incredibly important to us because it is your support that helps our channel grow and develop. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions make our content possible, and we value each and every one of you. Without you, our story would go untold and our voice would go unheard. Thank you for being with us. You are the heart of our channel, and we are truly proud of your engagement and support. Through the muffled hum of the airliner's engines, I could hear scraps of conversation. The light glare played on the plastic armrests of the seats, and the flight seemed as peaceful as 1,000 others. In first class, among the soft seats and tired business passengers, an atmosphere of secluded comfort prevailed, but everything changed in an instant. A stewardess named Karen, a tall blonde with a cold, intense gaze, glided along the row of passengers holding a tray of drinks. Her gaze slid down people's faces, lingering a little longer on those who, to her inner prejudice, didn't seem worthy of first class. She'd been with the airline for almost 10 years, and in that time, she'd accumulated a shadow of prejudice that she hadn't even tried to shake off. As she approached the man in seat A, her lips pressed into a thin line. He was dark-skinned, dressed in an elegant business suit, but that didn't seem to change her perception of him in Karen's eyes. She long ago internalized the image that the rich and successful were a certain type of person, and he clearly didn't fit that standard. The man sat with dignity, holding a clipboard, absorbed in business calculations. Karen's gaze lingered on him for a second, and a wave of irritation rose inside her. What was this man doing in first grade? Her fingers trembled, and she brought the coffee a little closer to his face. The moment the cup tilted and the dark liquid spurted out, it was impossible to tell whether it was intentional or just an unfortunate oversight. The hot coffee splashed onto the man's face, causing him to cry out in pain. The liquid dripped down his expensive suit, leaving brown stains. Karen took a step back, her eyes widening slightly, but she didn't rush to apologize. There was dead silence in the hall. Several people rose from their seats to see what had happened, and the man slowly withdrew the clipboard, his expression going from her to utter disbelief. The man tried to pull himself together quickly. His face was still burning from the burn, but his inner dignity had taken over. He raised his eyes to Karen, and there was something in that look that made her go cold. She expected anger, harsh words, or accusations, but instead there was a calm contempt in his eyes, as if he could see right through her. "I'm sorry," she gritted through her teeth, though the apology sounded cold and hollow. The man wiped his face slowly with a napkin. His movements were measured, as if he were weighing his every action. But none of the passengers, nor Karen herself, knew that this man was not just a successful businessman, not just one of the passengers, but the actual owner of that airplane. Moreover, he was an investor on whom the entire airline depended. One of the neighboring passengers couldn't help himself. "You should be more careful." A woman's voice, with a tinge of condemnation, sounded in Karen's direction. Karen lost her composure for a second, her cheeks reddening. She glared at the outraged passenger, but focused again on the man in front of her. He was looking at her now with an expression that sent a chill down her spine. "Are you all right?" Another steward turned to him, appearing from behind Karen. Seeing that the situation was escalating, he quickly took the tissues and offered to help, but the man only nodded and said quietly, "Thank you. No need. It's all right." But was everything really all right? Beneath the calm surface, something was clearly bubbling. Stewardess Karen could barely keep from shivering uncomfortably. She didn't know that in the next few minutes, something would happen that would turn her whole world upside down. The man continued wiping his face and neck, trying to wipe away the hot coffee residue, while Karen stood tensely by, as if unsure of what to do next. Her gaze slid over him again, this time with a tinge of slight irritation. There was no remorse in her eyes, no sincere desire to right the wrong. Instead, her prejudice was coming out in subtle gestures, arms crossed over her chest, a slight sneer in her raised eyebrow. Do you need help? Or can you manage on your own? Karen said with a touch of disdain, as if she thought he might be incapable of even simple actions. Some of the passengers nearby began to whisper, noticing her inappropriate behavior, but Karen paid no attention to it. In her heart, she was sure that this man, whoever he was, had no right to a seat in first class, and his presence here seemed almost insulting. Her prejudice was reflected even in the manner in which she adjusted her uniform, as if to emphasize her superiority. The man looked up slowly, and this time his eyes flashed with indignation. He had been trained to tolerate injustice, had developed the fortitude and ability to restrain his emotions, but now, doused with coffee, humiliated by the stewardess stare and realizing her deliberate disrespect, he felt something inside him break. "I didn't ask for your favor," he said quietly, but in a way that made Karen feel an unpleasant sense of menace wash over her. "But perhaps you should reconsider your behavior." Her face turned pale, but instead of apologizing or retreating, Karen only stiffened her back more stubbornly, as if trying to defend herself. She was sure of her integrity, and that her status as a stewardess would protect her. The cabin was getting quieter and quieter, and now even the most distant passengers began to pay attention to what was happening. People's eyes, some judgmental, others just curious, were fixed on the same. Some began to discuss how ugly the stewardess had acted, but there were also those who kept silent, not daring to intervene in the conflict. One of the passengers, an elderly white man in an expensive suit, snorted and muttered loud enough for Karen to hear. "This is what giving privileges to the wrong people leads to." Karen noticed out of the corner of her eye that the comment caused a slight smile from her colleague standing nearby. She was relieved that her behavior was at least somewhat approved, but at that moment a voice sounded that made her flinch. "I'm sorry," said one of the young passengers sitting across the row from the injured man, "but you are obliged to apologize. This is unacceptable." Karen turned to the young man, her face hard. "You don't have to interface, sir. I'm just doing my job." Her voice sounded icy, with more irritation than respect. The man in seat A raised his hand, gesturing for the young passenger not to continue, but Karen's eyes were already burning with stubbornness. Her behavior became more and more defiant, as if she refused to admit guilt. Everything was unfolding faster than she could have imagined. The man with the clipboard wiped the last traces of coffee from his face and, slowly standing up, looked around the cabin. His presence and majesty could no longer be ignored. He walked over to Karen, who stood with her back tense, and spoke so that everyone could hear. "Perhaps I've tolerated this conversation for too long, but let me introduce myself. My name is Marcus Williams, and I am not only your passenger, but also a co-owner of this airline." At these words, Karen turned pale, her lips hanging open in shock. Several passengers gasped, and others turned to get a better look at the flight attendant's face, which had a look of horror on it. "You have allowed yourself to be prejudiced and humiliated by a man on board, and that is unacceptable. I wonder what your superior will say when I describe this incident," Marcus continued, and his voice was calm, but every sound echoed with fear in Karen's mind. Silence hung in the air like a dense, unbreakable wall. Karen couldn't hide the trembling in her body. Her self-confidence evaporated, leaving behind fear and the realization of the catastrophe unfolding before her eyes. She realized that the situation had gone too far, but she couldn't believe it was getting worse. Marcus Williams, the owner of that airline, stood before her in full majesty, showing neither anger nor indignation, but there was something far more frightening in his gaze, cold-blooded determination. He was aware of his power, and he was ready to use it. The passengers around couldn't look away. For some, it was almost a theatrical performance, in which a minor injustice suddenly became a serious accusation. Karen felt her own prejudices, the same prejudices that had been quietly influencing her behavior for years, now coming at her with the force of a hurricane. She squeezed out, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "I really didn't mean to." But Marcus held up a hand, silencing her. He took a step closer, and now his voice was so quiet that it sounded as if it were penetrating her consciousness. "Whether you wanted to or not, your actions speak for themselves." His words sounded like a judgment. Humiliating and disrespectful attitude towards passengers is unacceptable, especially when it comes to people on whom your job depends. In the crowd of passengers, someone whispered, discussing the unfolding drama. A young woman with a baby in her arms shook her head in disappointment, and the man sitting next to her muttered, "Serves her right." Someone at the far end of the cabin was recording what was happening on their phone, trying to catch a moment that would undoubtedly go viral. Karen began to realize that her reputation and career were hanging by a thread. Everything she'd been hiding for years, her prejudices, the petty humiliations she'd inflicted on those she considered beneath her, suddenly came out. "I'm not sure you realize what the consequences are after this," Marcus continued, a steely tone in his voice, "but I believe your career with this airline is over. My respect for the team is based on equality and respect, which you have clearly failed to demonstrate." Karen opened her mouth to object, but her voice caught in her throat. Her world, full of illusions of her own superiority, was crumbling before her eyes. Before Karen could say anything, the crew chief, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, approached them from the back of the cabin. Her hair was in a tight bun, and she took in the situation at once, her eyes darting from one face to the other. "What's going on here?" Her voice sounded commanding, but tinged with concern. Marcus turned to her, remaining calm. "There is an egregious case of neglect that needs to be dealt with immediately. Perhaps you should listen to the whole thing from start to finish to understand what it's like to be discriminated against on your own plane." The crew chief turned pale. Her gaze flickered to Karen, but she was already looking quite depressed. She tried to make excuses, but the words wouldn't come out. All the pride she had carried was gone, leaving her empty and feeling inevitably punished. Marcus turned back to the crew chief. "I assume you'll handle this situation yourselves, but I expect more than an apology. I expect incidents like this to never happen again, because next time, the consequences will be even worse." He returned to his seat, and Karen felt her legs begin to shake. Her boss signaled for her to follow, and Karen, unable to resist, wandered toward the back of the cabin. She was in for some difficult conversations and even more difficult consequences. When Karen left, the tension in the salon began to subside. People went back to their business, but the whispers still lingered in the rows. Marcus closed his eyes and went back to his own business. But this situation would long remind him that the world was full of prejudices, and they had to be fought. Karen, hands clenched into fists, followed the crew chief into the small service room at the tail end of the plane. Her knees buckled with fear and every cell in her body clenched with the realization that she was no longer in control. For the first time in years, her arrogance crumbled, and she was alone with the grim reality. The crew chief, Mrs. Anderson, slammed the door behind her and turned to Karen with an icy stare. "Explain everything to me now," she said with barely contained irritation. Karen tried to find the words, but her voice was weak and broke on every word. I didn't mean to. It was just a mistake." "Hey," he turned suddenly, "and I accidentally spilled the coffee." She started to justify herself, but even she didn't sound convincing. Mrs. Anderson sighed, as if she couldn't believe she was listening to such pathetic excuses. "Karen, one of our major investors is on this flight, and you've made a scene that could cost our airline not only money, but our reputation. Do you realize what's at stake here?" Karen realized the seriousness of the situation, but there was still a shadow of resentment in her eyes. Why was she being judged so harshly? Was it her fault that this passenger was so important? "It's just an accident," she repeated weakly. Mrs. Anderson leaned closer to her, and her voice became almost a whisper, full of menace. "I saw you talking to him. I saw the look on your face and the coldness in your words. Don't you dare deny that your prejudice influenced your actions. How many other times have you done this? Karen, how many times have you allowed yourself to humiliate people by thinking you're better than them?" Karen averted her gaze, but her insides were seething. She wasn't used to this kind of pressure, and her mind was desperately searching for a way to defend itself. Perhaps something in her childhood made her become the way she was. Her parents had always taught her to respect only those who deserved respect, putting into her mind the image of successful, rich people of a certain kind. All of this turned into a toxic sense of superiority that she carried with her through the years. But now that feeling had become her greatest enemy. "You will stay in this room for the rest of the flight," Mrs. Anderson commanded. "When we land, I will personally report the incident to management, and you can be sure they will make a decision about your future with the company." Karen didn't answer anything. Her lips trembled, but she realized that no one else cared about her voice. The door slammed shut, leaving her alone. Meanwhile, A video recorded by one of the passengers has already started gaining popularity online. People were sharing it, discussing the incident, and expressing their outrage at Karen's behavior. Hashtags with her name and the airline's name began flying all over the internet, and soon the airline's management was already receiving the first messages demanding a fair investigation. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, passengers were beginning to return to their business, but a sense of tension never left the atmosphere. The young man who had earlier stood up for Marcus was still frowning as he remembered how Karen had tried to defend her actions. He felt justice in her punishment, but couldn't shake off the bitterness that such situations still happened in the modern world. Marcus Saturday still, his face once again a mask of businesslike concentration, but something inside him continued to stir. This case reminded him of the countless humiliations he had faced before, even after he had achieved great success in business. He was a billionaire, an investor, a man whose word could decide the fate of companies, but neither his status nor his wealth could completely spare him from encounters with racism. After a few minutes of silence, Marcus exhaled slowly and put the tablet on his lap. He looked out the window, where the clouds stretched out over the sky. He wanted to believe that one scene on the airplane wouldn't affect the company as a whole. He realized that not everyone in the airline shared Karen's prejudiced views, but the residue remained. His thoughts were interrupted by the quiet voice of the young woman sitting next to him. "I want to say that I admire your fortitude," she said. "There are few people who could keep their composure in a situation like this." Marcus nodded, acknowledging her support, but the fire of resilience still burned in his eyes. He knew that moments like this were not just his personal battle, but part of a much larger battle for equality and respect. The power of the internet knows no bounds. Within an hour of the plane being in the air, the video of the incident between Karen and Marcus went viral. Recorded on a phone, it quickly spread across all major social media platforms: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Comments and discussions grew like a snowball, with thousands of people expressing their outrage. That's why things like this need to be monitored. Discrimination has no place in 2024. One user wrote, "How can a flight attendant afford to treat a passenger like that, especially when it comes to the owner of the airplane?" Another publication was outraged. The airline has suddenly found itself at the center of a scandal that has now threatened its reputation. Management received the first call from reporters eager to know what action would be taken in response to the incident. But for now, they could only watch helplessly as the situation spiraled out of control. In the small service room, Kara Saturday with her hands clutching her head. Her mind was seething with rage and shame, but most importantly, fear. She knew that after this embarrassment, her career at the airline could be over. But what truly frightened her was the realization that she had become the prime target of public condemnation. Karen had always thought of herself as a successful, confident woman who could not be intimidated. But now, locked in her room and realizing the gravity of her transgression, she felt vulnerable for the first time. Her world was crumbling, and she had no idea how to rebuild it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ring of the phone. It was a call from her old work friend, Tom, who was now sitting at home watching the scandal unfold. "Karen, do you realize what's going on?" Tom's voice was troubled. "You've been all over the news. Do you even know they recorded a video of you humiliating the owner of the airplane?" Karen turned pale. She had no idea that her actions had been filmed and posted online. I didn't know," she answered quietly, her voice sounding distant. "That video, did it really spread?" "Yeah, and it looks terrible. People are demanding that you be fired. They want to know why the airline allows itself to keep such employees." Tom was silent for a second. "Karen, you have to do something, but be prepared. The consequences will be severe." Tears came to Karen's eyes. She remembered all the times she had allowed herself petty humiliation toward others. Her heart clenched at the realization that it wasn't just an accident. It was all the result of accumulated prejudices that she had never tried to fight. Marcus Saturday in his seat, trying to distract himself from what had happened, but fragments of the incident kept popping up in his mind over and over again. How many times had he faced similar situations in his life? How often had he had to fight bias and mistrust despite his accomplishments? Now he felt that this incident would have to be fought for, not only for his own sake, but for the sake of all those who suffered injustice. He realized that this incident could be an example of the importance of not remaining silent in the face of discrimination. "I'm sorry," to her came the voice of the young woman sitting next to him again. "I just wanted to say that what happened was unacceptable. I know you probably have to deal with this a lot, but you're not alone. There are many of us who support you." Marcus turned to her and saw the sincerity in her eyes. Those words, spoken while his mind was still seething with emotion, were a lifesaver. He felt the support he had been missing. "Thank you," he replied, nodding. "It means more to me than you can imagine." The woman smiled, and her gaze grew a little lighter. Marcus felt the tension in his chest begin to ease little by little, but he also knew that there was a serious conversation with the company's management and follow-up ahead. As the plane approached its destination, the atmosphere in first class remained tense. Passengers who had seen Marcus suffer from Karen's bias were now curious and excited to see what would happen when the plane landed. When the boarding announcement finally sounded, Marcus rose from his seat. Gathering his things, the crew chief, Mrs. Anderson, approached him. She looked tired but determined. "Sir, we are truly sorry for what happened," she said, trying not to show her excitement. "The airline management will be waiting for you in the terminal to discuss the incident and offer all possible compensation." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He could see that this woman understood the gravity of the situation, but she was also a hostage to the system. "I hope they realize it's not about compensation," he said. "It's about making sure this never happens again." Mrs. Anderson nodded. She knew that this incident would be a serious lesson in the airline's history. She walked Marcus to the gate, and their gazes crossed for a second, her eyes filled with humility and a willingness to act. When the plane landed, a group of journalists had already gathered at the airport, waiting for Marcus. He was ready to talk, ready to fight for justice, knowing that his voice could make a difference. The airline was at a crossroads. They had to either radically overhaul their internal rules and anti-discrimination efforts, or face even more serious consequences. But one thing was clear, this case could no longer be hushed up. As Marcus stepped off the plane, he saw a growing sea of cameras and microphones in front of him. Journalists, reporters, and even some activists with placards were already waiting for him at the exit. A crowd was gathering around him, and everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. He realized that this could be a pivotal moment not only for him, but for many people fighting for justice and equality. Marcus straightened up. Gathering his thoughts, he could see the faces of the people in the crowd. Some were expressing sincere support, others were watching curiously, and some were holding signs that read "No racism on board" and "We demand justice." "Mr. Williams, tell us about the incident on board," shouted one of the reporters, holding out a microphone. Marcus raised his hand, calling for silence. He took a deep breath and began to speak firmly. "I would like each of you to understand that this incident is not just a matter of my personal experience. It's a much deeper issue. It's about the systematic prejudice and discrimination that continues to exist in society. And unless we all start fighting it, incidents like this will happen again and again." His voice was calm, but there was an iron determination in it. The cameras captured his words, and they immediately began to spread on social networks. Journalists kept asking questions, but Marcus decided not to go into details, realizing that words should be measured and thoughtful. "I believe the airline will take the necessary steps to make sure it doesn't happen again," he finished, nodding. "But my goal is to make sure we all learn from this incident and don't let discrimination be part of our reality." After a short talk with the press, Marcus was invited to a special meeting room where airline representatives were already waiting for him. The serious faces of the executives reflected the realization of the magnitude of the disaster in which they found themselves. The CEO, a man with thick gray hair and a serious expression, rose to meet Marcus and extended his hand. "Mr. Williams, thank you for agreeing to meet with us despite what happened," he began, trying to sound confident, but there was a note of tension in his voice. Marcus responded to the handshake but didn't smile. He sat down across from the CEO and his team, waiting for them to continue. They were clearly nervous, realizing that they had not just the salvation of the company's reputation in their hands, but also an attempt to make amends for a serious transgression. "We are extremely sorry for what happened," the director continued. The behavior of our flight attendant is not in line with our company values. We have already initiated an internal investigation, and those responsible will be punished." Marcus listened attentively, but his face remained impenetrable. "Are you sorry for what happened, or for making it public?" he asked, glaring at them. The director hesitated for a moment, but then quickly corrected himself. "Both of these aspects are of concern to us. But first of all, we are concerned about the fact that it appears that our employees may be acting with bias. We are going to implement additional anti-discrimination training and review our staff." Marcus nodded. He realized that words were only words. It was actions that mattered. "This is a good start," he said, "but I want to see real change. I am ready to work with you and offer to help create a more inclusive and equitable environment. But if this remains just lip service, I will use every resource I have to achieve justice in other ways." These words, spoken with absolute certainty, caused the management to exchange nervous glances. They knew they were playing with fire. At this time, at the other end of the airport, Karen was sitting in the waiting room, waiting to be called to management. She tried to hold herself together, but inside her heart was being torn to shreds. News of her misbehavior had already spread across all news channels and social media. Her face was flashing in the headlines and people were discussing her with disdain and judgment. Soon she was called into an interrogation room. In front of her Saturday, the airline's internal investigations team. They looked glum, realizing that this case was a disaster that couldn't just be swept under the rug. Karen began, one of the executives, a woman with cold gray eyes. "Do you realize that your behavior has jeopardized our company's reputation?" Karen nodded, but there was still a spark of stubbornness in her eyes. "I made a mistake, but it wasn't intentional. Hey, I didn't think it would have these consequences." The supervisor leaned forward. "Your prejudiced views were obvious. We have received numerous complaints from passengers who have witnessed your manner and attitude. This is not an isolated incident. Karen, your behavior will be scrutinized." Karen tried to justify herself, but realized that her words meant nothing. She fell into a heavy silence, realizing that her fate hung in the balance. Marcus left the meeting room feeling devastated, but not defeated. He knew he had done everything he could to bring attention to the problem. Now he could only hope that his efforts would bear real fruit. At the airport exit, reporters approached him again, but he tiredly deflected all questions. He was ready to leave when suddenly he felt someone touch his shoulder. He turned around and saw the same young woman from the airplane who had supported him. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did," she said with a smile. "You have inspired many of us not to be silent in the face of injustice." Marcus looked at her, and his heart warmed. He realized that his struggle had not been in vain. His voice had been heard, and now he had the opportunity to use this situation to bring real change. "Thank you," he replied, "but this is just the beginning." With those words, he headed for the exit, feeling that there was more work to be done, but also knowing that he was not alone in this battle for justice. The events that unfolded on board the airplane became a real hurricane in media space. Over the next few days, the discussion of the incident did not subside. News agencies discussed the details, experts analyzed the incident, and public activists demanded justice. The very video of flight attendant Karen spilling coffee and her dismissive behavior towards Marcus Williams garnered millions of views. Comments were shared by the thousands of people around the world, made posts in support of Marcus. Meanwhile, Marcus was in the center of attention. He had to give interviews, explain his position, and tell over and over again that discrimination is a problem that cannot be ignored. Despite all the negativity, he felt the support of thousands of people who were inspired by his resilience and confidence. The media attention became not only a tool to put pressure on the airline, but also an occasion for a national discussion about bias and inequality. One of the evening talk show hosts invited Marcus for an interview to tell his version of events and explain why this case was so important. The studio was crowded. The audience watched with curiosity as Marcus walked on stage under the bright lights of the cameras. "Marcus, thank you for coming today," began the host, a middle-aged man with a warm and friendly voice. "What happened to you has shaken the whole country. How do you feel after such a shock?" Marcus looked at the audience and thought for a moment before answering. "I feel like my personal story has become part of a larger movement. People support me, but it also reminded me of the millions of others who face injustice every day and have no way to defend themselves. My face on magazine covers is not about my personal victory, but about the collective fight for equality that we are all waging. Applause broke out in the hall. The presenter continued, "What do you think the airline should do to remedy the situation?" Marcus straightened, his voice harder. "I don't just expect them to apologize or compensate me. I want to see real action, employee training, better internal policies, inclusion counselors. All of these should become the norm. We live in 2024. Intolerance of racism and discrimination will not be tolerated." While Marcus was participating in public discussions, people began to gather in the streets of several major cities to protest. They carried placards with slogans against racism and discrimination. Civic organizations quickly mobilized, demanding transparency from the airline. Many demonstrators chanted, "No place for racism," and "We demand change." People of all ages and nationalities could be seen among the crowd of protesters. One of the organizers of the rally, a young activist named Jason Lee, addressed the crowd from a stage set up in the center of the city. His voice sounded loud and confident. "This case has shown us that racism and bias still permeate our society. But we will not be silent. We must stand together and fight for justice." Marcus Williams has shown that it is possible to stand up to injustice, and now it's up to us to support him and make a difference. The crowd responded with raucous applause and shouts. The protests continued into the late afternoon, and people everywhere discussed how such incidents shape our view of the world and make us think about systematic discrimination. Meanwhile, a movement with the hashtags Justice for Marcus and Norm for Racism was gaining momentum on social media. Ordinary people were sharing their stories of injustice, raising their voices in support of the fight for equal rights. Marcus realized that this moment was part of a new wave of awareness. Meanwhile, the airline's management was in a real crisis. The CEO and his team were urgently holding meetings to find a way to save the company's reputation. The first reaction was to issue a formal apology. But this was not enough. Public pressure demanded decisive action, and the company was forced to review its internal procedures. At one such crisis meeting, the CEO looked at his deputies. "We can't just gloss over this," he said. "We need to show that we are serious about this problem. We need a clear plan of action, not just words." One of the board members, an older man with a bushy mustache, suggested, "We'll have to fire Karen and do a full internal investigation." "But that's not enough. We must implement a training program for our staff, analyze for systemic problems, and hire inclusion consultants." The CEO nodded in agreement. But that was just the beginning. They realized that one incident could have long-term consequences, and they would have to work to regain the trust of their customers. Karen, meanwhile, found herself in complete isolation. After returning home, she couldn't open any social media accounts without seeing angry comments and threats. Her face flashed across news headlines, and her name became a symbol of shame. She was fired from her job, and now she waited to see what other consequences would befall her. Shutting herself in her small apartment, Karen slowly sank into depression. She couldn't believe that her life had changed so quickly, but even more painful was the realization that her preconceptions and attitudes that she thought were normal had led to such a collapse. Karen Saturday in the darkened room, looking at her reflection in the mirror, she saw a tired, tormented woman who now had to face the realization of her mistakes. Her thoughts went back to her childhood, to how her parents had instilled in her a hatred of those who were different from her. For the first time, she was beginning to realize how deeply those prejudices were ingrained in her and how they were poisoning her life. She decided to write a letter of apology to Marcus, but she didn't know if he would accept it. She realized that her actions had already done irreparable damage and that a simple apology might not be enough. However, she felt she had to try. A few days later, Marcus received a letter from Karen. It was handwritten, and in every word there was pain and remorse. "Marcus, I write this letter knowing that you may never forgive me. My behavior aboard the plane was not only unprofessional, but disgraceful. I want to sincerely apologize for the humiliation you have suffered. For the first time in my life, I am faced with the realization that my actions were driven by prejudices that I didn't even realize I had. I realize that an apology will not restore your lost dignity, but I hope that it will be the first step in me reassessing my values. Sincerely, Karen." After reading the letter, Marcus was silent for a long time. He saw that there was real pain and remorse in those words, but he also knew that one apology would not change the situation. But this letter gave him hope that perhaps even the most stubborn prejudices can begin to disappear if a person realizes his mistakes and is willing to change. Marcus Saturday in his spacious office overlooking the city, deep in thought. The letter from Karen lay on the desk in front of him. It stirred up a host of feelings in him, from anger to compassion. Remembering what he had been through in his life, he thought about the fact that racism and prejudice do not come from nothing. They are part and parcel of entrenched systems in which generations have been raised. Marcus knew that his own history of anti-discrimination began when he was a child. He had grown up in a poor neighborhood where he had faced prejudice from the very beginning. Teachers mistrusted him, police officers detained him for no reason, and employers were reluctant to give him a chance for a long time. These memories were painful for him, but they were the ones that hardened his character and helped him to rise up. But Karen's case reminded him that racism had not disappeared. It lurking in the little things, in facial expressions, in the tone of voices, and in evasive glances. Even after he had become one of the most powerful businessmen in the world, Marcus had repeatedly found that people judge him not by his accomplishments, but by the color of his skin. Marcus recalled how a few years ago, one of his business partners had turned down a deal when he found out he was African American. He was at a prestigious business meeting where everyone was dressed in expensive suits, and it seemed that only money and influence mattered, but racial prejudice proved stronger. The partner, a middle-aged white man, said with a dismissive look on his face, "I thought your company belonged to someone more trustworthy." Marcus would never forget that moment. He felt rage boiling up in his chest, but he had to restrain himself so as not to let it show. Such moments were painful, but they became lessons for him. They taught him that in this world, you had to fight for your right to be respected, that you couldn't let prejudice win. That was why he wasn't going to let the incident with Karen go without repercussions. That incident was more than just spilled coffee. It was a symbol of everything he and millions of others continued to face. Meanwhile, the airline was forced to act decisively. The whole world was watching to see how management would respond to the demands of Marcus and the public. The company's chief executive, Mr. Harrison, called an emergency board meeting. The boardroom was filled with tension like a taut nerve. "We have to come up with a plan that not only addresses the incident, but also shows that we are serious about fighting discrimination," Mr. Harrison said, wiping his glasses and looking at his advisors. One of the airline's lawyers offered a solution. "We need to do more than just fire Karen. We need to take action that is visible to the public. Let's announce the creation of a fund to support victims of racial discrimination and launch a series of inclusion trainings for all employees." Some council members nodded, but others looked doubtful. "It's going to cost us millions." One of the older council members objected. "Maybe we should just issue an official statement and hope things settle down." Mr. Harrison shook his head. "No, we can't afford to ignore this. The situation is out of control, and if we don't do something significant, our company could lose a lot more." The board decided to start implementing the proposed measures immediately. They hired a PR company to restore the airline's image, but this was only a temporary step. They had to build a new approach to dealing with staff, and for this they invited experts in the field of anti-discrimination. A few weeks later, despite her dismissal, Karen was invited to attend the inclusion training that all airline employees were required to undergo. It was a difficult and emotionally exhausting process. A group of several Down-seen people Saturday in a large room where trainers talked about how prejudice creeps into our minds and how it can manifest itself in everyday life. Karen Saturday in the back row, her face pale. She was angry and embarrassed that she was here. She didn't think she deserved this humiliation, but the more she listened, the more she realized it wasn't that simple. In one of the classes, the trainers showed real stories of people who had suffered racial discrimination, and it shocked her. One such story was that of a man who was stopped by the police on the street for no reason, just because he was dark-skinned. Karen saw the pain in his eyes as he recounted how he had been forced to kneel on the cold asphalt, even though he had done nothing. Her heart clenched at the realization that her own actions may have brought such pain to others as well. After the training, Karen couldn't find a place for herself. She Saturday in her apartment, feeling something change inside her. She realized that she was part of the problem, part of the system. that made people like Marcus vulnerable and humiliated. Her prejudices were deeply ingrained, but now she couldn't ignore them. Karen remembered the moment on the plane when she had looked at Marcus and seen him not as a person, but as a stereotype. She began to realize that her behavior was not random, that her hatred and contempt were the result of her upbringing and the environment in which she had grown up. But now she couldn't stay the same. She made an appointment for counseling with a psychologist, hoping that she would be able to understand herself and her prejudices. She needed to understand how her own fears and hatred had led her to humiliate a man who had done nothing wrong to her. Meanwhile, Marcus was faced with a difficult choice. He was offered the opportunity to work with the airline to create a new anti-discrimination policy, but he was struggling with the feelings, the desire for justice, and the bitterness of his humiliation. He realized that an agreement to cooperate could be seen as forgiveness, as if that incident could simply be forgotten. But he also realized that this was a chance to make a real difference. The meeting with that airline was scheduled for Friday, and the day before, Marcus Saturday in his office, thinking about the future. He knew that his choice would affect thousands of people. He wanted his actions to be an example, so that people who faced injustice would see that it could and should be fought. His musings were interrupted by a call from an old friend, James, who had also been through many trials in the fight against racism. "Marcus, you have to do what you think is right," James said. "You've always fought for justice, and I know you'll make the right choice. But remember that sometimes victory comes through cooperation, not confrontation." Those words made Marcus think maybe he really should use this occasion to make a difference. Marcus stood at the window of his office, looking out at the city stretching out before him. James's words kept echoing in his head like the quiet voice of conscience. He was a man who had faced injustice many times in his life, and each time his choice had been to fight. But now he was at a crossroads: cooperate with the airline and try to use his influence to bring about change, or stay on the sidelines and continue the outside pressure, hoping it would be enough. His assistant Amelia, a blonde woman with a lively gaze and always calm presence, entered the office with a notebook in her hands. She could see that Marcus was absorbed in his own thoughts, but she knew that a conversation about the upcoming meeting was inevitable. "Marcus, you have a good chance of getting them to change the system," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But it won't be easy. You're going to have to convince them that everything you're proposing isn't just pretty words. They need real, tangible change." Marcus turned to her. Her eyes glowed with support, and he could feel that she believed in him. But he also knew that his every move would be under scrutiny. Hundreds of thousands of people were watching him, seeing him as a leader who must carry the torch of justice and equality. He could not afford to falter. Finally, the day of the meeting arrived. The airline's office was packed with senior executives. There was a dead silence in the room, and tension hung in the air. The CEO, Mr. Harrison, stood at his seat with a concerned expression on his face. He knew that Marcus had the leverage to destroy their company's reputation if he wanted to. Marcus entered the room with confidence but not arrogance. He sat her down at the long table across from the management, and his gaze was warm but firm. "I'm willing to discuss solutions," he began, leaning forward, "but only if those solutions are real, not superficial. People want to see change, not for my peace of mind, but for everyone who faces this kind of attitude every day." The CEO nodded. He realized they were playing by Marcus's rules, and they had no other way. Their discussion began by analyzing the incident and how it reflected broader issues. Marcus proposed a series of measures: mandatory inclusion training, internal investigations into complaints of bias, and the creation of an equality and fairness committee that would include both company employees and independent experts. Each of his proposals caused excitement among the leadership. Some of the board members glanced around, clearly concerned about the financial and reputational costs that such initiatives might entail. But Mr. Harrison knew they had no other choice. If they refused to cooperate, the company would find itself in an even deeper crisis. "We agree," the director finally said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "But we'll need to show that this partnership is about long-term change, not immediate impact. Are you willing to help us do that?" Marcus looked into Harrison's eyes and saw there not only fear for the future of the company, but a sincere desire to make things right. It was what he had been waiting for. He realized the system wouldn't change overnight, but if he could be the catalyst for that change, he owed it to himself to try. Yes, Marcus replied, I'm ready, but remember, any retreat, any lie, and I'll be back here demanding explanations. There will be no mercy this time. A tense silence hung in the air. Then Harrison nodded in relief. In the following weeks, the company began to implement the promised measures. Open meetings were held with employees to discuss racism and bias. The inclusion team began to develop new standards, and Marcus was involved as an advisor. Every step it took was carefully recorded and publicized. Karen, meanwhile, was going through the most difficult days of her life. Her dismissal was just the beginning of her torment. Social media kept her on her toes. Threats and angry messages poured in day and night. She realized that she had become a symbol of everything people hate about racism, and it was painful to realize. She continued to go to counseling sessions, trying to understand why she had become the way she was. One day, sitting in a cafe, she overheard a neighboring table discussing her incident. Two young men were talking indignantly about how this flight attendant's behavior reflected the deeper problems of society. Karen felt her heart clench. She wanted to scream, to explain that she wasn't a monster, that she was trying to change, but she realized that her words wouldn't convince anyone. One day, Karen decided to write another letter to Marcus, but this time not to apologize, but to ask him to meet. She knew he probably wouldn't even want to hear from her, but she had no other choice. She had to try. The letter arrived in Marcus's hands a few days later. He stared at it for a long time, wondering if he should answer at all. He remembered his childhood, all the times people hadn't given him a chance because they were prejudiced. He knew that simple forgiveness wouldn't change Karen, but maybe talking to her could be another step towards something more. They met in a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Karen looked tired and exhausted, her eyes red with tears. She sat there fidgeting nervously with her fingers until she saw Marcus approaching her table. Everything frownsy inside her. This was the man she felt guilty about, and now she was going to have to face him. Marcus sat her down across from her without saying a word. He waited for her to begin. I don't know what to say except that I'm really ashamed, Karen mumbled, her voice low and choppy. I always thought I never hurt anyone, but now I realize how cruel my mistake was. Marcus stared at her, trying to see if her words were sincere. He saw the broken man in front of him, but he needed more than words. Repentance is a start, but what are you going to do next? He had asked coldly. Do you realize that is not enough? Do you realize that thousands of people experience this kind of thing every day? Karen lowered her head, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. I want to change that, she whispered. If you can, give me a chance to show that I can be better. Marcus was silent for a long time. He knew that forgiveness didn't come easily, especially when such deep wounds were at stake, but he also knew that people could change if they were willing to make the effort. All right, he finally said, but not for me, but for those who have been hurt by people like you. If you're willing to work on yourself and do something useful, maybe one day you can earn respect. Karen nodded, her face wet with tears, but there was hope in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt that her journey to redemption was just beginning. Marcus left the coffee shop, leaving Karen immersed in her thoughts. He felt he had made the right choice, but his heart was heavy. It seemed to him that talking to her wouldn't yield instant results, but it was a chance for change. He kept walking, reflecting on the fact that people like Karen could get better, but it would take a lot more than an admission of guilt. Their biases had taken too deep a root, like a weed sprouting in the soul, and required constant work on themselves. As the months passed, the situation around the airline, Karen and Marcus, only escalated. The incident on board the airplane was not just a flash in the news, but a real movement that stirred up society. People organized actions and discussed the problem of systemic racism on talk shows and social media. Youth organizations organized rallies to discuss the importance of equality and respect. However, not everyone was thrilled with the changes Marcus began to promote. Every day, he received more and more anonymous threats. Some people who held old prejudices could not accept that their privilege and prejudiced views had been condemned. One evening when Marcus returned home, he found a broken bottle on his porch with a note. You crossed the line. Stop messing with our lives. He knew his fight for justice had made him a target, but he wasn't about to back down. Instead, he stepped up security measures around his home and office. He also had to hire a bodyguard to feel somewhat secure. Meanwhile, Karen struggled to right the wrongs of her past. She began attending support groups where people who had realized their bias shared stories of how remorse had changed their lives. But none of these activities could erase the stigma that the incident with Marcus had left on her. She still received hateful messages. Her former friends avoided contact with her, and her attempts to get a new job failed one after another. One day, Karen decided to attend one of the rallies for equality that the activists had organized. She stood in the crowd, feeling terribly alien, but at the same time realizing that she had to be here. People were holding placards that read, "We will not be silent," and "Justice for all." Karen realized that her appearance here was almost sacrilegious. She was part of the problem these people were fighting against, but she needed to hear what they had to say. A young activist named Jason Lee took the stage. His speech was fiery and his voice echoed throughout the square. He spoke about injustice, about how people continue to face discrimination, even in the most ordinary situations. Karen listened, feeling each word pierce her heart like a knife. Suddenly, the crowd's attention was drawn to the shouting. Karen turned around and saw a group of masked men who approached the protesters with a clear intention of provoking a conflict. One of the men, clearly in an aggressive mood, began shouting insults and threats. Karen noticed something like a metal rod clinking in the hands of one of them. The atmosphere was heating up, and a sense of impending trouble hung in the air. Karen felt panic overwhelm her. She had never been in such situations, but she realized that things could get out of control now. The crowd began to thicken. The protesters tried to move away from the aggressive group, but space was limited. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. One of the provocateurs threw a bottle with paint into the center of the rally, and panic began. People shouted, pushing each other. Someone fell, and Karen found herself in the center of the chaos. She tried to step aside, but suddenly noticed one of the aggressive men heading straight for the stage where Jason Lee was standing. Karen felt the blood rush to her head. Her heart was pounding so hard, she thought it was going to burst out of her chest. She couldn't let anything happen. Obeying an inner impulse, she rushed toward the stage. Jason, seeing the approaching threat, tried to back away, but the provocateur was already too close. Karen, driven only by instinct, stepped between him and the aggressor. She didn't have time to realize what she was doing when the metal bar flew through the air. The impact was hard and painful. She felt the world around her blur and fell to her knees. Pain coursed through her body, but she held on to keep from passing out. The protesters rushed towards her and the aggressors retreated, realizing that their attack would not go unnoticed. The police, who had already started arriving on the scene, quickly brought the situation under control, but Karen was still lying on the ground, feeling the blood trickling down her temple. People surrounded her. Someone called an ambulance, and she smiled weakly, seeing that at least Jason was unharmed. When she was taken to the hospital, news of her action quickly spread across social media. People discussed that the former flight attendant, whose name had become a symbol of racist bias, had now stood up for truth and justice at the risk of her life. Many called it redemption, but there were those who still could not forgive her past mistakes. Marcus found out about it when he got home. He sat in his office watching the news and couldn't believe his eyes. Karen, the woman who had humiliated him aboard the plane, now found herself the victim of violence herself, defending those she had once despised. It was hard for him to know how to feel about this. Part of his soul was still full of anger at the humiliation, but another part of him realized that people could change if they had the will and opportunity to do so. The next day, he went to the hospital to visit her. Karen was lying in a hospital bed, pale and tired, but there was fire in her eyes. She saw Marcus, and her eyes filled with tears. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly, barely getting the words out. Marcus moved closer and sat her down next to her bed. He stared at her, trying to find an answer in her haggard face. "I think you deserve a chance," he said finally. "What you've done is not just an act, it's a step toward becoming a better person. But the road ahead is going to be long, and you're going to have to prove that you really want to change." Karen nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she still had a chance to fix the future. Marcus stood up, about to leave, but stopped in the doorway. "We're all human, Karen, and we're all capable of changing. You just don't give up." With those words, he walked out, leaving her with the feeling that she still had hope. In the following weeks, Karen continued to recover, but her life would never be the same again. She began speaking at events about the importance of working on herself and overcoming prejudice. People listened attentively, seeing her sincere remorse in her words and her desire to make a difference in the world. Marcus, on the other hand, became part of a movement that continued to grow. He felt that the fight for justice was far from over, but now he had not only the support of thousands of people, but also the realization that even the most difficult souls could find their way to the light. It had been several months since the incident at the rally, but the wounds, both physical and emotional, continued to bleed. Karen was gradually recovering, but every day was an ordeal. She lived with the realization that her entire past was now the subject of constant discussion and evaluation. Her attempt to redeem herself, her sacrifice at the rally, all attracted both support and hatred. Racist comments continued to pour in on social media, and the haters now targeted her even harder, dubbing her a traitor. Many of those who shared her from her views now despised her, believing she had succumbed to pressure and surrendered her principles. Her house had become like a fortress. The windows were permanently shuttered, the doors were locked, and she could no longer feel safe even within her own walls. Threatening letters and anonymous calls became part of her daily life. Karen realized that her road to redemption would be long and painful, and at times it felt like the whole world was united against her. One night, as she sat in her living room, she heard something crashing at her door. With her heart pounding in her chest, she cautiously walked over and peered through the door peephole. A broken Molotov cocktail bottle lay on the porch, and the fire had already started. Panic overwhelmed her. Karen quickly grabbed the phone and called the fire department, then rushed to put out the flames, which were spreading rapidly. Neighbors jumped outside, watching the chaos, and some of them began screaming as they saw the fire engulfing her front porch. When the fire department finally arrived and the fire was put out, Karen sat on the ground, shivering and trying to hold back tears. This wasn't just an accident. This was an attack, planned and brutal, designed to remind her that her former allies were now her enemies. The attack attracted media attention, and soon her house was surrounded by journalists. Cameras captured every detail, and Karen was once again the center of attention. But this time, she didn't want to talk to the press. She felt vulnerable, broken, but at the same time, even more determined to continue on the road to redemption. Marcus, having learned of the attack, could not stay away. He knew that the situation was becoming more and more dangerous, and now racism had turned not only against him, but also against a man who was trying to change his life. He contacted activists to organize a roundtable to discuss the violence born of hatred and prejudice. The event, which was held at a large urban center, brought together people of all races and ages. On the stage stood Marcus, Jason Lee, who was still the leader of the equality movement, and other well-known social justice activists. Marcus began his speech by describing the horrifying incident with Karen. "Violence will not solve our problems," he said, and his voice was full of passion and determination. "It only makes them worse. Today we see how hatred turns people into beasts, ready to destroy anything that does not conform to their view of the world. But the struggle for justice must not stop. We must show that love and equality are stronger than fear and hate." There was a tense silence in the hall. People listened attentively, but Marcus knew that even here there were those who still carried prejudice, those who doubted that racism could be eradicated. Some faces remained tense, their looks expressing dislike. Not everyone believed that Karen deserved a second chance. Not everyone believed that change was possible. When Karen, still pale and shaking from stress, took the stage, she was greeted not only with applause but also with cheers of displeasure. It was hard for her to speak, but she knew she had to do it. She took the microphone and, trying to hold back tears, began, "I made a terrible mistake. I was part of the problem, and I can't change my past, but I'm here because I believe people can change. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be useful, that I can fight for justice, even if I didn't realize it before." Her voice shook, but she continued despite the tension in the hall. People began to whisper, and someone shouted out, "People don't change. You're still the same." Karen clenched her fists, but she didn't give up. She realized that her redemption was not a one-day journey. It was a long and arduous process. After her speech, the hall was divided. Some supported her with applause, while others turned away in disbelief. But one thing was clear: the topic of racism, bias, and violence continued to be a painful wound, and healing it required more than words. It was a struggle that required action. Subsequently, Marcus and Karen joined forces to create an anti-racial discrimination and bias program to educate and enlighten people. They began visiting schools, organizations, and holding seminars, talking about how racism not only destroys lives, but also turns society into a battlefield. However, the threat did not disappear. Those who were against the change began to act more violently. One evening, as Marcus was returning home, his car was surrounded by several hooded men. They shouted insults and threw rocks at his windows. The bodyguards had time to intervene, but this situation sent a clear message. The fight for justice was now a real war. Marcus began receiving more threats, but now they were more ominous and detailed. One of the anonymous letters read, "You think you can make a difference? You are wrong. We will not let you destroy our world." The words sounded like a promise of violence, and Marcus knew that the time for peaceful words might be running out. The society began to divide. Some supported the movement for equality, while others became even more aggressive in their resistance. Racism not only intensified, but took on a new form, manifesting itself in aggressive actions and violence. The darkness seemed to thicken, threatening to swallow up all the efforts of those who fought for the light. But Marcus and Karen, despite the fear and danger, continued on their way. They knew that if they gave up now, all their struggle would be in vain. Their hearts burned with the hope that one day love and respect would overcome hatred, but they also realized that there would be more pain and trials ahead. 1 year after the events aboard the plane launched a massive movement for equality and justice, the city seemed to have changed. What began as a horrific encounter with racism and hatred had grown into a powerful movement that united people from all walks of life. Marcus and Karen became the central figures of this changing time, and their efforts, despite their trials, finally began to bear fruit. Their line, thanks to public pressure and Marcus' hard work, completely transformed its policies. They introduced mandatory inclusion and equality training for all employees and set up a committee of independent experts to monitor and investigate any complaints of discrimination. The old system, which ignored injustice, was destroyed, and in its place was something new that sought to ensure respect and equal rights for everyone. After a painful journey of redemption, Karen continued her work with the anti-bias organization. Her speeches to school children, community meetings, and charities touched people's hearts. She spoke about her experiences, her mistakes, and the importance of recognizing and confronting one's biases. Her story was an example that people can change if they are sincere in their desire to do so. But it wasn't that simple. Throughout that year, Marcus and Karen had encountered obstacles. Haters continued to threaten, and there were still those in town who didn't want change. But they persevered. They turned every threat into motivation to continue their fight, every act of violence into an opportunity to bring more people to their cause. One day, a rally was held in a huge park in the city to symbolize victory. Thousands of people gathered to mark a year of struggle for justice. On the stage stood activists, movement leaders, and those who had made a huge contribution to change. The atmosphere was saturated with joy and a sense of unity. Marcus stepped up onto the stage, and the crowd greeted him with loud applause. He looked at the people in front of him, people of all races, ages, and backgrounds. They were not all here for one person, but for a common cause. "A year ago, we started this fight," Marcus began, and his voice echoed in the hearts of everyone present. "A year ago, many people thought that change was impossible, that racism was a disease that could not be defeated. But look around you. We stand here today not as enemies, not as divided groups, but as a united community that has proven that love, justice, and equality can win." The crowd erupted in applause, people shouting and raising their hands in support. Karen stood in the crowd, her eyes glistening with tears. She realized that her journey had not been easy, but she had been a part of this victory. She knew that her efforts had helped change the world, at least a little, and that was the most important thing. Jason Lee, who became close friends with Marcus and Karen during that time, took the microphone and added, "We're not done yet. Our work is not yet done, but today we celebrate what we have already accomplished. We celebrate those who have not given up, who have fought, and who continue to believe in a better future." The rally went on for a long time, but on that day it became clear justice had won its victory. Yes, there was still a lot of work to be done, but people were no longer afraid to speak the truth. The system that once protected bias now began to change. Airlines, corporations, Even the government began to look more closely at issues of equity. Later that evening, as the crowd began to disperse, Marcus stood on the hill watching the sunset. Karen walked up to him and stopped beside him, her face calm and peaceful. "Do you think this is really the end?" she asked, looking up at the receding sun. Marcus shook his head, but there was a light of hope in his eyes. "No, not the end, but the beginning of something great. We've shown that we can change the world, and now it's up to us not to give up." They stood together, two people who had gone through fire, through pain and fear, but still found the strength to go on. Their hearts were full of faith that the future would be brighter, that their struggle had not been in vain. And at that moment, when the sun was completely hidden behind the horizon, it became clear, justice has indeed won, and its fire will burn in the hearts of people for a long time, lighting the way for the next generations. Friends, this story is a reminder of how important it is to fight for justice and equality. We'd love to know what you think of it. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you had instances in your life where you have experienced racism or seen injustice to others? How did you deal with it, and what helped you keep your faith in the best? We are incredibly appreciative of each and every one of you. You're not just viewers, you're part of our community, and your stories, your comments, your thoughts make a huge difference. It is because of you that we continue to create the kind of stories that touch hearts and make you think. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new inspiring stories. Each of your likes and subscriptions helps us to develop this space of kindness and understanding. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a great day filled with warmth and light. Remember, your voice is important and you can change the world.